Have you ever been told that Africa had no history before Europeans arrived? That's a lie. A dangerous lie that fueled centuries of oppression and continues to shape our world today. This is the story of how that lie was constructed, the civilizations it erased, and the ongoing struggle to reclaim Africa's true history. For centuries, Africa was portrayed as a blank slate, a continent without civilization, waiting to be discovered and enlightened by Europe. But the truth is far more complex and far more glorious. Long before European explorers set foot on African soil, vibrant civilizations thrived, leaving behind legacies of innovation, art, and sophisticated governance. Let's start with ancient Egypt. Flourishing from around 3100 BC, it was one of the world's earliest centralized states, a beacon of knowledge and power that influenced cultures across the Mediterranean. Then there's the Kingdom of Kush, centered in Nubia, modern-day Sudan. For centuries, Kush was a formidable power, even ruling Egypt as the 25th dynasty around 744 to 656 BC. These weren't just isolated pockets of civilization. The Aksumite Empire, in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, emerged around the 1st century CE, minted its own coins, and adopted Christianity in the 4th century under King Ezana. Further west, the Mali Empire rose to prominence in the 13th century. Mansa Musa, who ruled from 1312 to 1337, became legendary for his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, a spectacle of wealth and grandeur that captivated the world. The Songhai Empire followed, continuing the legacy of West African trade and scholarship. In southern Africa, Great Zimbabwe stood as a testament to African ingenuity. This magnificent stone-built city and political center flourished from the 11th to the 15th centuries. The Benin Kingdom, in present-day Nigeria, developed highly sophisticated court art and governance from the 13th century onward. The Congo Kingdom formed in the late 14th century and maintained diplomatic ties with Portugal after 1483. And the Asante Empire, consolidated in the late 17th century under Ose Tutu and Okomfo Anikai, demonstrated the power and resilience of African political organization. These empires weren't isolated. They were connected to global trade networks. The trans-Saharan trade routes linked West Africa to North Africa and the Mediterranean for centuries, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. East African coastal cities like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Mogadishu were integrated into the Indian Ocean trade network as early as the first millennium CE. The Swahili city-states developed a cosmopolitan culture, blending African, Arab, Persian, and Indian influences. So, how did the myth of a historyless Africa take hold? It wasn't accidental. It was deliberately constructed and promoted to justify the horrors of slavery and colonialism. One of the key figures in this historical distortion was George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. In his lectures on the philosophy of history in the early 19th century, Hegel portrayed Africa as outside of history, outside of reason, and outside of progress. This deeply racist framing provided intellectual cover for later colonial ideologies. C. G. Seligman's 1930 book, Races of Africa, further cemented this false narrative. Seligman promoted the Hamitic hypothesis, claiming that any civilization in Africa must have come from non-black outsiders. This idea was used to deny African agency and attributing any achievement on the continent to external forces. The transatlantic slave trade, which lasted from the 16th to the 19th centuries, saw more than 12 million Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic. The dehumanization and brutal exploitation of enslaved people were justified by the belief that they were inferior, without history or culture. Colonial regimes systematically erased local governance, writing systems, and oral traditions from official records. They replaced them with European narratives that emphasized African backwardness and the need for European intervention. The violence and atrocities committed during the colonial era were often minimized or omitted from popular history. The Herero and Nomo genocide, perpetrated by German colonial forces in German Southwest Africa between 1904 and 1908, serves as a stark example. Under the command of Lothar von Trotha, the German forces issued an extermination order, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of Herero and Nama people. This horrific event is widely recognized by scholars as one of the early genocides of the 20th century, yet it remains largely unknown to many. Even in conflict often framed as between Europeans, the suffering of Africans was downplayed. British concentration camps during the Second Anglo-Boer War detained Boer civilians, but the devastating impact on African civilians was often overlooked. But Africa was not historically isolated. Ethiopia maintained long-standing diplomatic and religious connections to the Mediterranean world. The Kingdom of Congo sent embassies to Portugal and developed a literate Christian elite. African merchants and scholars actively participated in Islamic intellectual networks across North and East Africa. And the voices of African women are often missing, not because they were absent, but because colonial records systematically silenced them. Oral history, court memories, and local traditions preserved women's roles, which colonial archives often ignored. Women like Zingaman of Nongo and Matamba, who resisted Portuguese expansion in the 17th century, and Yasantewa, who led the War of the Golden Stool against the British in 1900, demonstrate the power and influence of African women throughout history. The denial of African agency even extended to archaeological sites. For decades, European settlers and pseudo-scholars claimed that Great Zimbabwe could not have been built by Africans. Modern archaeology has definitively proven that it was built by ancestors of the Shona and related African populations, but the initial denial was politically motivated, designed to undermine African claims to land and self-determination. The Hamitic hypothesis shaped real policy. Colonial administrations used the idea that civilized elements in Africa must have come from outside Black Africans, influencing education systems, ethnographic classifications, labor policy, and even ethnic favoritism. So, why does this history matter today? Because the lie that Africa had no history continues to have consequences. It shaped modern racism, segregation, apartheid, and the persistent idea that Africa needs external guardianship. It affects debates about land, identity, and reparations. Many African school systems still struggle with colonial-era syllabi, Eurocentric textbooks, and limited teaching of pre-colonial history. There are ongoing debates over the return of looted artifacts, the restitution of cultural property, and the recognition of colonial atrocities as genocide. Modern African states often use pre-colonial history to build national pride, establish historical legitimacy, and counter racist stereotypes. But Africa is still often portrayed in global media as poor, passive, and independent, a modern continuation of older historical lies. The fight for historical justice is far from over. Campaigns continue for the recognition of the Herero and Nama genocide, for reparations for colonial land dispossession, and for a more accurate and nuanced understanding of Africa's past. Africa's history is not a blank slate. It's a rich tapestry of civilizations, empires, and cultures that have shaped the world. It's time to reclaim that history and challenge the lies that have obscured it for too long.